This is House Planning Help episode 62. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're looking to build or retrofit a new home, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century, and it's my personal goal to create an energy efficient home before I turn 40 in August 2016. And coming up in this session, we chat to building services engineer Alan Clarke. We're looking at how you go about choosing a heating system for a low energy building. How are you doing? I hope you're well, and thank you yet again for downloading the podcast. At this end, things always seem to be busy. I've just got back from the AECB conference in Bristol, which, as ever, loads of interesting talks and a few ideas of topics that I could delve into in the future. If you're a UK-based building professional, I would definitely encourage you to go along next year, particularly if you're someone who's just starting out. They're always after young blood, and there's a lot of experience in the AECB. So what I'll do is I'll put a link at the bottom of today's show notes if you're interested in signing up to the AECB. houseplanninghelp.com/62. One of the things that we did on this, well, you could sign up to, was go on a tour of a self-build scheme in Ashley Vale, Bristol, which I found absolutely fascinating. Jackson Moulding gave this talk about the scheme. He's one of the founders there. And it made me realise that I'd never actually visited a self-build scheme where there are multiple self-builds on a single plot. I've been to lots of co-housing, or maybe not lots, a few co-housing sites, which I always find fascinating. It's funny, even this self-build scheme, you do feel a draw on co-housing happening. They have a central space where all the kids can go and play. And I found the variety what was really incredible, that they'd all set out. And sometimes you think, it's not going to work. If everyone goes off and just lives out whatever idea they want to, it's all going to go wrong somewhere along the line. And yet the place was just full of character. It was absolutely fascinating. And what I really want to do is try and get Jackson onto the podcast in future, or someone else from Ashley Vale. So I'll work on that one for you. What's most incredible is that they were quite lucky to get this site, because it was going to go to a big developer, and we all know what would happen if it went to them. It would just be another very standard, very run-of-the-mill in terms of efficiency housing estate. And in contrast, it's absolutely amazing. So all sorts of things that they've learnt along the way, which hopefully we can bring you another time. Today's topic is in response to a question from Sam Weatherall in France. We'll get to the specifics of that soon, but really the whole episode is thanks to his desire to learn a little bit more about heating systems and how we select them. So I've enlisted the help of a well-respected service engineer, Alan Clarke. He's got lots of experience, and particularly in relation to passive house buildings. A lot of this episode, when we're talking about heating systems, it's because it's for our climate, so European climate. I appreciate if you're somewhere hot, you might want the cooling. We must do an episode on that at some point, so the reverse, the flip side, because almost everything we do, because I'm based in the UK, is in relation to our climate. I started by asking Alan to share a little bit on his background.
I've been involved in energy and buildings in my whole career, really, working in large consultancies on big buildings and on small and medium-sized buildings as a small partnership or sole trader. We've been working on low-energy buildings all along, really, and when Passivhaus came along, that kind of seemed to cut out some of the debate of exactly how much insulation we have. We'll just say we'll have a passive house and we can get on with worrying about how to do it now. And now, I look at quite a lot of heating systems for individual passive houses and for schools, other smaller non-domestic buildings and flats and the like.
When we're considering heating systems, I presume it has changed a lot since a traditional building to what you might want in a low energy building.
One of the things, we do find is that you don't really need to heat every little corner of a well-insulated house. On the one hand, obviously, the heat loss from each room is going to be quite a lot less. And the other point is that there's no cold surfaces. If we've got triple glazing and we've got rid of all the thermal bridges, you don't have to worry about putting radiators under windows and that sort of thing anymore.
What factors affect the heating requirement that you're going to need for a house?
Well, in brief, that's the heat loss of all the elements of the fabric and the ventilation, so that's what affects it. The total heat load is affected by the size of the building, but then particularly we've got the wall U value, the insulation value of the wall, that is, and the windows and the ventilation system. And working with Passivhaus specifications and including heat recovery ventilation, we come down to very low levels of heat, but there's no expectation that we can do without heat completely.
You say that there's no expectation that we can do without heat, but is that considering occupant heat or the incidental heat? Are there scenarios where we wouldn't need a heating system at all?
Not normally, unless we've got our sums wrong, because we do include the solar gain and the internal heat gains from occupants and the like. The snag we've got is that those gains are very variable. Obviously, you could have a sunny day when it's -5 outside, and with the right house, no heating's needed. It's great. Then a week later, it could be raining, could be 3 degrees, completely overcast, and actually it would get a bit cold. Of course, you could put the oven on and make baked potatoes, but if you're out, there's a bit of heat needed, and it is quite variable. But you will get cold at times if you don't have a heating system to do that.
Talking about particularly small buildings, I've seen certain people who say they just don't put on their heating systems at all. Perhaps they find the building, even in winter, because it's so small and they've got so many people in there, that they don't need it. But is this just because they haven't been tested, as you say, with that weather condition that will mean that they will need something?
There could be enough heat sources if people are living in the house all the time. They've got a hot water cylinder which is always giving off heat. Maybe they've always got the telly on, and it depends a lot on the occupants. And some terraced houses or apartments have got very low total heat loss, so those gains can quite easily make up for the heat loss in most conditions.
How do you design that, though? Because you might think that this house will only have 2 people in, and then actually, if it's for social housing or for some other reason, it ends up having 5 people in and a couple of dogs and, as you say, all the gadgets switched on.
I think we have to pay good attention to the controls, because it's not simply a case of it's winter, we need heat. Some days you need a lot, and some days you might not need any at all. So good temperature control based on the temperature inside the house is important. Generally, if you're using gas heating, you're trying to throttle down a boiler which is really too big for the job. So there's controls that are able to lower the temperature that it runs at are the best way to go, I think. They effectively reduce the power of your radiators by reducing the temperature they run at, as well as increasing the boiler efficiency.
We have different ways that we could create this heat. If you're in a town or a city, are you normally using gas or electricity?
Gas, basically. I know there's concerns about the fact that it's a fossil fuel, it's a finite resource. Our key emphasis in Passivhaus buildings has been to think about energy first and think about reducing the energy demand, and worry to some extent where that energy comes from afterwards, because one source of energy is quite convertible to another quite often. Yeah, it's just the key thing is to use less, basically. The carbon emissions from gas are not that different at the end of the day to those from using a heat pump, which is getting its electricity from the mains grid, with the current way we generate electricity, which is burning fossil fuels. That's not the key thing that some people think it might be, that heat pumps do use energy. They use a high-grade energy, which is electricity, and that has a higher carbon impact than gas. Which isn't to say that we don't also use heat pumps, particularly places that aren't on the gas grid. The downside at the moment is that they're new and fairly expensive bits of kit, and on mains gas someone could be looking at an annual bill for heating and hot water of £200 or £300, and you could be looking for a heat pump installation upwards of £10,000. When you look at how long that's going to last, 10, 20 years, it may not be that good, but if it is, that would still be £500 a year you've laid out in capital on a heat pump, and you could have had a gas boiler for a few £100 and be only paying a few £100 in gas as well. So when you're putting your money into windows and insulation, I think the heating system is no longer that important. It's not the right end of the pipe to be solving the problem.
And is there a wide range of these boilers? Because they're not high-powered like before. We're talking a different type of boiler.
There are one or two extra small boilers, but I've not used them. The problem is to have something that is readily installable by your plumber, so you're not making a rod for your own back in terms of sourcing hard-to-find equipment, hard-to-find spares and instructions in foreign languages. If you just want to use a good quality boiler from one of the main suppliers in the country, we do end up with something that goes down to maybe 3 kilowatts on its lowest output, a bit more if it's a combi boiler, and the heat load of our house probably, if it's a modest sized passive house, will probably be 1 kilowatt at most. So that's where we have to think about how to deal with that in the design of the rest of the heating system.
And they work in exactly the same way as other boilers, or are they? What you're saying is that they're very similar to other boilers.
Well, they are the same as other boilers. We
Fine.
just work out what's the best way to control a normal gas boiler, the sort that would be used in a modern developer house. Also doesn't have a huge heat load normally, and make it fit the job.
But it will be sensing the temperature and then just kicking into gear as and when needed.
Yeah, as I said earlier, the favourite sort of controls are actually measuring the room temperature, then bringing in a bit of what you might call intelligence, or might call a simple algorithm, to work out that the boiler doesn't need to be running at 70 degrees. It can be running at 55 because the room is pretty much up to temperature already, and that avoids the tendency of the boiler to run flat out, overheat the space, flick out with the old click of the old thermostats, and then cool down again until it's gone almost too cold. So with the smarter sort of thermostat, the boiler just sort of ticks on and off at a very low output to try and just keep the place topped up with heat.
I think this is a good point to address a question that has come in from Sam Wetherall, and I'm going to read a portion of that, and that's one of the reasons that I decided this would be a good time to chat to Alan. Sam says, we are building a timber frame post and beam house in the Haute-Savoie department of France of around 200 square metres. It will be in line with the French RT 2012 norms on energy performance, so requiring no more than 50 kilowatt hours per metre square per annum, achieved through being quite airtight, triple glazed, and having good levels of insulation. Our current thinking on space and water heating is to install a condensing gas boiler rather than a heat pump. Air source heat pumps are very popular in France, but we're not so sure that we'll see return on the additional cost versus a gas boiler, which is actually what we've just been talking about. We are lucky to be on mains gas in the village. The research I have suggests that the benefit of an air source heat pump versus an efficient gas boiler can be marginal, especially as the real efficiency of the heat pump drops dramatically in cold weather. Our house will be at around 700 metres altitude, so not too high, but we can get cold winters here in the Alps, so that is a factor. And Sam really wants to know some of the factors in general, which we've talked about when choosing a heating system for a new home. And I suppose more specifically, as we know his situation, how do you think he's doing in what he's thinking?
As you realise, I kind of agree with him that as he does have mains gas in the village and he's probably not got an infinite budget, the condensing gas boiler would be a good choice for his house, which is around the AECB silver standard of energy performance, which is low heating demand but not as low as a passive house. He makes a good point about air source heat pumps. In particular, there's a sort of fundamental thermodynamic characteristic of the fact that the bigger the temperature difference they're trying to raise heat from, so the colder it is outside, the more work the heat pump has to do, so effectively the less efficient it gets. So it's not the way round you want it, but when it's 10 degrees outside, nice and warm, the heat pump is efficient and running at maximum output. When it's minus 10, its output has dropped dramatically, maybe by a factor of 2, some cases maybe, and the efficiency also dropped by that sort of amount. Part of that drop of efficiency is the fact that the thing has to keep stopping every short period to defrost itself because it's trying to extract heat from air that's below the freezing temperature. They do that and they don't stop working. It just means if it's running for 50 minutes and then is defrosting for 10 minutes, you've already lost a sixth of your capacity. So it's what people are worried about hitherto has been actually just the capacity lost, that they bought a heat pump that said 5 kilowatts on the label, and then in the worst case scenario, when their house heating demand is actually a little bit more than they expected because it's a cold snap, their heat pump is nowhere near the output that it said on the label at running at 2 degrees centigrade, because now it's minus 5 or minus 10. And if you then have to switch on to direct electric heating, you've really lost the efficiency benefits of the heat pump. Interestingly, air source heat pumps in some ways look more advantageous in a passive house in the performance, the way they perform, because when we look at the heating demand through the year, we see that 60 or more % of the total heat demand is for hot water, and hot water demand doesn't vary much through the year. There's not a intense peak in the coldest part of the year, so the performance of the heat pump is much more consistent through the year. And on that basis, air source heat pumps actually look quite a sensible option for passive houses, although conventionally heat pumps have been optimised for doing heating. We've looked at ground source heat pumps, which generally only work at fairly low emitter temperatures and are only really suited to underfloor heating. In a passive house where we're looking largely at hot water, we do really want to look at heat pumps that are optimised to producing 55 degrees temperature output, and the space heating side of that is more or less tacked on and isn't the primary use of the heat pump really.
So it seems that Sam's he's on a good track here and doing okay. Can we just change the circumstances? Just maybe I'll ask a few more questions about, for example, biomass boilers. When would you think I need that, or would that just not apply to a passive house?
There's a whole lot of issues around biomass boilers here. There's the old hut in the woods approach where you're evidently coppicing or using fallen timber around you, and it appears to be perfectly sustainable, and you can see the woods growing and you're just harvesting some solar energy a few years later. Then you can sort of fast forward to now with power stations shipping whole forests of pelletized timber from Canada. This appears to be clear felled and is not in any way sustainable. So a lot of modern biomass boilers are using the same fuel sources of wood that is not being regenerated at the rate that it's been consumed, and therefore is actually putting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere faster than if you were using a gas boiler.
How would you be able to check that, or is this part of the problem?
Yeah, that could be part of the problem. As I say, if you, on a small scale with your own little coppice in the back garden, that's one thing, but if you're having to buy your fuel on the market, then it's probably not really going to be as sustainable as you like, I think. Well, basically once demand exceeds the renewable supply, even if it's your neighbour that has to buy the dodgy pellets, if you're all buying pellets, then you're creating more demand than the renewable supply can provide.
Are there any other relevant renewables in this equation?
Well, for heating, in a way, no, because it's the demand for heat itself comes at the coldest and darkest times of the year, and there's a simple thought, well, if I have a heat pump and I have some solar PV, that'll do my heating, won't it? But if the sun's shining and you've got a passive house with some windows facing the south, you probably don't need the heat when the PVs are working. On the other hand, when we come to hot water, you might see that you can generate maybe 70% of your hot water by running your heat pump when the PVs are generating. Although in the past we've tended to think of photovoltaic generated electricity as being really expensive and to be put into the grid and used in the most efficient way. What we're seeing now in Germany is that through the summer, daytime renewable generation is so high, even with their current levels of photovoltaic installation, that people are now being encouraged to go down this route of convert that electricity into hot water, which can be stored rather than having to draw on the power stations in the evening when they want to shower, or in the morning before the sun comes up. So that is a sort of a new direction of renewable energy in this field.
Is there a final thought or just a recap when we look at heating systems in low energy buildings?
As ever, we sort of say keep things simple, really. People love to get carried away with thermal stores and a little wood burning stove here and a heat pump here, or maybe a gas boiler as backup. We'll have loads of solar thermal panels feeding into this store, and we'll have underfloor heating there and radiators upstairs. And at the end of the day, that's more complicated than you need if you've built a well-insulated box. I mean, you could have a wood burner, you could just be burning logs on the living room stove, and you'll find that your bedrooms upstairs will be perfectly warm. Or you could have the gas boiler and a radiator or two. It's not really the right end of the problem to be addressing, to be bolting on technology, because we're looking at how much heat the house needs, which is really how much heat it loses to outside. So by focusing on the building fabric, we've really solved a lot of the problems before they've arisen.
Alan, thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
You can find today's show notes at houseplanninghelp.com/62. We've summarised the main points. There are some photos and links on there as well. I have a question for you. It's a passive house specific question today, so only relevant if you're someone who lives in a passive house, because I want to know, how often do you use the heating in your house? There's a question. Tell me some of that. Be great to interact with you on the show notes for this page. Once more, houseplanninghelp.com/62. And I have one call to action, and that is, please subscribe to our email newsletter. I could give you a number of reasons, but I'm just going to stick to one today, and that is that we've got lots more helpful tips and resources from our experts. So if you'd like to sign up to that, head to houseplanninghelp.com/subscribe. Next time, Doug King is our guest, and we're going to delve into the world of data. As self-builders, should we be collecting data? And if so, what? And when we've got all this data, is it actually going to be useful? So I look forward to finding out a bit more about that next time. Cheers.